Hi, and welcome back to the History Hut. I'm Jim. This is Dr. K, and we're talking about life in Carolingian times. So, are there any other things you can tell us about this period?
Well, of course there are. Glad you asked. A couple of things. One is travel. You know, during the Roman period, you've got thousands of miles of lovely straight Roman roads. After the fall of Rome, there aren't soldiers protecting any of those roads anymore, and they fall into kind of disrepair. People don't travel much at all. It's considered to be too dangerous. You still have monasteries, and aristocratic homes are still expected to provide hospitality to travelers, and this goes back to Burgundian laws of hospitality. You shouldn't turn away people, and if you don't offer shelter, you can face kind of fines. So monasteries typically had guest houses attached to them, one for pilgrims and the other for paupers. That would be you and I. We would probably fall into that category. So travel, just generally, it's perilous. It's to be avoided at all costs. And if you really think about it, you think about fairy tales from that period, even like Grimm's fairy tales, everything's about the forest. And even if you go to the modern period and you're looking at Tolkien and The Hobbit, never fall asleep under a tree, Tom Bombadil's wandering through the forest, trees walk. The forest has always had this fascination. Hansel and Gretel, Little Red Riding Hood, just like people terrified of the forest. Yeah. So the roads become atrocious. They fall into a state of disrepair. There's lots of bogs around, and I don't mean toilets, and primeval forests. And this is, of course, where the fairy tales, the trolls, the gnomes, the fairies. I mean, we think of fairies in the same way that we think in this kind of secular angels just now. People go around with little angel brooches and stuff. And fairies were considered in fairy tales. Fairies are actually really dangerous. If you fall asleep under a tree, you can be snatched off to the fairy kingdom, come away human child to the water. You can be replaced with a changeling, and nobody will even know that that's happened. So even fairies who sound, they always look really pretty, Tinkerbells, they're dangerous. So you have packs of wolves and wild boar and wild oxen, and also tales of wild humans who kill travelers and probably eat them as well. So people, if they had to travel, they would set off quite well protected. They would have their shield and a spear. They would travel or walk, and it's said, I can't be entirely sure, but they travel or walk on the left side of the road, and that's because, unlike you, most people are right-handed. So travel on the left side, and their right hand would be free to use their spear or their axe, and kind of like, watching for people. No one really could police the roads, and the fords were unbridged, and ferrymen acted as robbers. And there's all sorts of classical tales where you have to pay the ferryman, to go to Hades, or you have to pay the ferryman, in this case, just to get to the other side. So they would take you midstream and then rob you, and then that was it. So you see the development of taxes. One is called a pontage. That's charged if there's a bridge, so you would pay the pontage to get across the bridge, or a toll called a travers. If you wanted to wade across, you still have to pay, and peasants en route to market had to pay the péage, which is the foot tax. So there were ways of moving around, but gradually, I suppose, most roads couldn't be used by carts, so foot and horse travel only, and the only source of comfort was really the monasteries, and you had clerics and pilgrims and some traders. They're really the people that venture out. So there's very few maps. Most of them are wrong, and there's lots of monsters on them as well. So people were, advised in advance, this is dangerous. There be dragons, kind of not just sea travel is dangerous, travel past any forest is dangerous as well. So travel, that's an interesting thing. So it changes. There's less of it then with the fall of the Roman Empire. Another thing, food. The food that people ate, the staple food of the rich and the poor was, as it still probably is, was bread. Well, for us, with our Irish backgrounds, it's the potato was our god, but for other people, it was bread. So poor people ate coarse bread with barley and oats in it, a lot of roughage, very kind of 21st century, pay $6 for a loaf that's full of nuts and God knows what else, right? And it was the rich that ate white bread. So there was alum put in the bread to make it look white. So rich people are actually eating the worst kind of bread. And the cheapest bread now, of course, is white bread. And ordinary people also ate vegetables that they would grow on their land, and that was more or less it. They don't get a lot of meat unless they're poaching, and if they don't live close to a river, then they don't have access to much in the way of fish either. The rich had more variety because they would usually have cattle, and they use dairy products. Milk turned bad very quickly, so they would have butter and cheese. You couldn't grow olive trees in the north, so it's not oil, so you wouldn't be using healthy oil. You'd be cooking with butter, which is a cholesterol feast, I'm sure. At first, everybody kind of ate what vegetables there were, but by about the 12th century, a really odd thing happens. The clergy and the aristocracy decide that they're not going to eat things that come from the ground because the ground is closer to hell than the devil. So they get off from having to eat their Brussels sprouts.
Oh, well,
that's a benefit.
Bad, yeah,
that's kind of a benefit. They didn't, of course, have access to things like sugar cane, so they used honey as a sweetener in food and ale. They used spices, but spices are incredibly expensive, and they have to travel by road from the Silk Road all the way through. So until Europeans actually go out and discover the New World, and a faster route to India, of course, which is what they're trying to find. Only rich people would have spices, and they would bring them out mostly for show, though. So you'd kind of go, "Hello, would you like to have dinner with me? Yeah, there's my pepper. Don't touch it. There's my you can have salt. Feel free to have the salt. Just get your hands off the nutmeg. That's really expensive." So people actually ate quite heartily, and I suppose that's because they were working hard as well. They're all kind of manual labor. So the estimate it's amazing. The estimate is that people sometimes consumed up to 6,000 calories a day. So huge amounts. Early monastic rations were 4 pounds of bread a day. Like a lot. 1.5 quarts of wine, 1/4 pound of cheese, and 1/2 pound of vegetables. But so that's in the monasteries. But a lot of poor people were still malnourished because there were long periods in the winter when there was no fresh food available. They practiced the winter slaughter, so they would kill most of the cattle, and then it would all be salted. So you get salted beef or salted whatever, salt pork, salted herring, and they just buried meat in barrels of salt, so you can imagine how salty that tasted. In season, poor people would eat cabbage and carrots and peas, and as I said before, what we would consider to be really, really healthy bread. They didn't use plates, so it would be... in Canada, Tim Hortons, when they have what is it they have in the winter, their stew bowl, where it's just a big loaf carved out and stuff in it. So it'd be like that. So they'd use flat slabs of bread or big chunks of bread, and then of course you would eat off it, and then the stuff would have soaked through it, and so it was actually edible by the end of it, although not edible at the beginning. They didn't use spoons or forks, and it was a BYOK, bring your own knife. So you bring your own knife to eat your dinner. They only ate twice a day, so they'd eat at breakfast, usually before you go into the fields, and then about 3 o'clock. And so if possible, you just scarfed as much stuff as you possibly could at both those meals, because that was all you were getting. That was it. And there's some really funny rules of good dining from this period, and I'll just read you a couple of them because they're just kind of amusing. You were not to fart at the table. You think that would be a given? Yeah. I don't think so. You weren't allowed to spit on the floor or pick your nose or look for head lice while you were at the table. So no farting, spitting, nose picking, or looking for head lice, and no fondling the breasts of women at the dinner table.
All sound like very barbaric things to be doing at the dinner table.
They don't sound too civilized, so you'd want to make people avoid that at all costs. So all classes, including monks, drank to excess. Taverns were the most common sight in villages and at pilgrimage centres. And
so not much has changed.
No, and wine was the favoured drink, and of course monks took great pains in making different alcoholic beverages. People would drink water, but only if they knew it was absolutely for sure a clean source. So always a good excuse for drinking It's like, oh, I don't want to come down with a horrible disease. I'll have that barrel of ale, please. So you get that. One of the other things is hygiene. And this is a matter of some controversy, because a lot of modern or early modern historians will tell you that people were quite stinky back then, and then there's an equal number of medieval historians who say that's rubbish. Or people weren't stinky at all, so we get kind of clannish about this. But it does seem that people had an aversion to water. Charlemagne had hot and cold baths at his palace, and he insisted that his aristocrats bathe once a week. People thought that was rather odd. They're like, really? They had to change their clothes when they bathed, so this is an attempt by him to clean up the court. And it's quite remarkable when you consider that even in the 18th century, lots of people would spend the entire season in their clothes, in the same set of clothes. And I know for medieval Scotland as well, just after the turn of the first millennium, people would more or less kind of sew their clothes on and keep them on until the spring, and then they would change them then. So of course there's going to be a few smells. Bathing was a practice used to ward off disease in the Carolingian period, but then it falls out of favour again after that. It's avoided because it was believed that it robbed the body of its natural immunities, and you were really inviting disease. And to be fair, you get things like the cholera epidemics, and that has to do with contaminated water, and they don't find out about that till the late 1800s, so you have to be fair to people. They also used bleeding. They practiced bleeding. We talked about the four humours. Remember, they're recopying Roman texts, so bleeding for lots of different diseases, and they used herbal remedies to cure disease as well, and they got these from the Roman records as well, so the monasteries kept those. I'm just trying to think, an Anglo-Saxon remedy for baldness. Now, you've probably never had watercress. Have you ever had watercress in a sandwich? No? Well, it's a lovely wee thing that looks kind of bean sprouts, but prettier. If you want to characterize vegetables in that sort of way.
Okay.
In case a man's hair falls out, take the juice of this thing called the crest, the watercress, and put it on your nose, and your hair shall grow. Mm-hmm. Or if you have sore hands or chilblains, take white frankincense and silver cinders and brimstone and mingle them together, add oil, warm the hands, and smear them with the mixture and wrap them up in a linen cloth. So you've got techniques for operating on soldiers that have been wounded in battle as well. So that, they do benefit too from the old Roman manuals. But it's really difficult for people because of this kind of aversion to water, and because animals roamed freely in the villages and the small towns, and so there's human and animal waste all over the place. The butchers would dump the offal in public, and there's just an example of one Frankish nobleman who fainted from the stink kicked up by his horse's hoofs. So it's just like, and the wild pigs everywhere. So very, very, very kind of difficult, and probably a bit stinkier than today. So that's
a bit,
kind of comments. Lots of sickness as well, and they just kind of called everything leprosy at one point, and didn't kind of differentiate between all the diseases. And lepers have to wear little bell, and it was seen as a divine punishment for sins. But it could be anything from a bad case of zits all the way to actual leprosy. Yeah. So I think staying at home was a good idea in this period.
In the short term, what happens to Europe after the death of Charlemagne?
Well, I mean, he dies, of course, in 814, and we've looked at two things. We looked at kind of movement of peoples and the conquest and expansion of certain groups, and we've looked at how they kind of lived their lives. But in terms of politics, you have to remember that although Charlemagne intended to divide his empire up between his three sons, remember, two of them died before he did, and so it ends up going to Louis the Pious, or Louis le Debonair. And yes, and he lives until he's born in 778. He lives until 840. So you have Louis the Pious, but he runs into problems with his own sons fairly early on, and so this whole Frankish thing of division continues. So in 817, quite early into his reign, remember, he co-ruled with his father in 813, but in 817 he set out the succession arrangements for his boys, and he has lots of boys, but he has 3 in particular that he's going to give lots to. So Lothar, the eldest, by the early 820s is kind of named as the co-emperor, and all his brothers are considered to be kings but under his authority. By 829 Louis gave an inheritance to his other son Charles the Bald, and this brought a revolt from the oldest son, so a bit of trouble there. And actually in 833 Emperor Louis is taken prisoner by his eldest son on what's called the Field of Lies, and it's called that because the emperor's imperial army defected from him, so it's called the Field of Lies. And he's actually deposed, and his son Lothar rules alone. And you know, he's deposed a wee bit later on, but after Louis dies, the empire begins to implode because Lothar demands the allegiance of all of his brothers, and they disagreed, and they got together and they defeated him, and so they swore allegiance to each other, and then Lothar renegotiated with them, and the empire's actually split 3 ways by a treaty, a famous treaty called the Treaty of Verdun, and that's in 843 AD. So you have Louis the Pious under attack by his 3 sons, then the 3 sons, a lot of infighting between them, and then a formal division of this great Carolingian empire. So Lothar got the central bit and the imperial title, so he gets kind of Belgium, Holland, Lorraine, Alsace, Burgundy, places like that. Louis, who's called Louis the German, he got the eastern bit, which later would be Germany. That's why he's called Louis the German. And Charles the Bald, he got the western bit, and that's later, of course, France. So there's a lot of Lothar dies in the 850s, and then there's a lot of short reigns that follow. Lothar's son and namesake ruled, followed by Charles the Bald, and then by 881 Charles the Fat. So you know, it wasn't enough that they had a baldy one, they had a fat one as well. So this continues on into the 900s, so lots of short rules, but lots of internal problems, and then a new dynasty after the death of, I think it's Louis V, about 987. A new dynasty emerges. The successor is, I always say because I'm Scottish, Hugh Capet, but since he's French and it's E.T., it's probably Hugh Capet. What do I know? This starts or begins the Capetian dynasty, and later on the Capetian dynasty gives way to the Bourbon dynasty, and that's the one that takes us all the way into the French Revolution. You know, so it's just the kind of the Carolingians and the Capetians, and then the Bourbons. And although the Capetian dynasty has the support of many elites, the Capetians never attain the wide sweeping influence of the territorial power that Charlemagne had, or even Louis, his successor, had. And they have trouble with another group. So you think everything's settled, all the barbarians have already moved, we're all in place. But no, they have trouble in particular with a group north of them, and they're called the Northmen. They're also referred to as the Normans. So if you're trying to work out what happens after the death of Charlemagne, you have to really look to the north. And that's what we'll have to do. I know, the north again. I'm terrified. Yeah. You know, just I keep looking around, going, well,
in one direction, anyways.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Well, that wraps up this discussion down in the History Hut. We'll see you next time.
Okay, bye.